Every forecast begins with a model. Every model begins with assumptions, and every set of assumptions contains, buried somewhere in the middle, one assumption that is doing more work than any of the others. One assumption that the entire forecast depends on more than any other single input. And that is, in most forecasts, the assumption that is least explicitly examined. The assumption is buried not through negligence. It is buried through the structure of how forecasts are built. The analyst starts from what they know, models the relationships they understand, and generates the projection from those known relationships. The assumption that is doing the most work is usually the one that feels most obvious, the one that is so embedded in the analyst's understanding of the domain that it doesn't feel like an assumption at all. It feels like a description of how things work. Before the 2008 financial crisis, the most consequential buried assumption in housing economics was that home prices had never declined nationally, simultaneously, since the Great Depression. This assumption was not hidden in the financial models that rated mortgage-backed securities. It was explicit. The historical data showed no nationwide simultaneous decline, and the models were calibrated to that historical distribution. What made it a buried assumption, rather than a known input, was the lack of analysis of what the model would produce if the assumption failed. The models were stress-tested against scenarios that included regional declines, sector-specific corrections, and individual loan defaults. They were not stress-tested against a scenario of nationwide simultaneous decline, not because the possibility was unimaginable, but because it had never occurred in the historical data the models were calibrated on, which made it feel like a condition the model did not need to address. The buried assumption was not a mistake in the modeling. It was a feature of how historical data is used to build models. The scenarios that are modeled are the scenarios that have historical precedent. The scenarios that are excluded are the scenarios without historical precedent. And the most dangerous failure mode for any model is a scenario without historical precedent because that is specifically the scenario the model was not designed to handle. The structure of the buried assumption appears across every domain this channel has examined. Nokia's assumption that the competitive threat from the iPhone would manifest as a hardware quality competition rather than as a platform ecosystem competition was not a mistake in the analysis of the hardware market. Nokia's hardware analysis was correct. The buried assumption was that the relevant competitive dimension was hardware, and that assumption was not made explicit because it was so embedded in how Nokia's analysts understood competition in the mobile phone market that it didn't present itself as an assumption. It presented itself as a description of the industry. Blockbuster's assumption that the Friday night in-store experience was a durable competitive advantage because it reflected how most customers preferred to rent movies was not a mistake in the analysis of customer behavior. The customer data in 2000 supported the assumption. The buried assumption was that how most customers prefer to rent movies today was a reliable predictor of how most customers will prefer to rent movies when broadband penetration reaches 50%. That assumption was never made explicit because it felt like a tautology. Of course, customers' current behavior predicts their future behavior, absent any significant structural change. The significant structural change, broadband, was visible, but its implications were not embedded in the assumption. The LTCM assumption that the historical correlations between financial instruments would maintain their relationships during a market stress event was made explicit in the model's mathematical structure. What was buried was the assumption that historical correlations included correlations during the kind of global flight-to-quality event that the Russia default produced. The historical correlations that the model was calibrated on were correlations from periods that didn't include that specific kind of global correlation breakdown. The model assumed its historical calibration covered the distribution of future scenarios. It covered the distribution of past scenarios. Have you ever identified, in retrospect, the specific assumption that was doing the most work in a forecast that turned out to be wrong? The assumption that nobody had explicitly examined because it felt like a description of reality rather than an assumption about it? Leave a comment. The practical technique for finding buried assumptions is specific and was developed by Gary Klein as the pre-mortem, a technique referenced in an earlier episode, but worth examining here from the specific angle of assumption identification. The pre-mortem is, assume the forecast has failed, and then ask what the failure reveals about the assumptions the forecast was built on. This technique is specifically designed to surface buried assumptions because it asks the question, what would have to be false for this forecast to be wrong? And the answers to that question are, by definition, the assumptions the forecast is built on. The answers to the premortem question identify the assumptions in a specific order. The assumptions that feel most certain are the ones whose failure seems most surprising in the premortem scenario. The more surprising the failure of an assumption feels, the more likely it is that the assumption is doing a lot of work in the forecast. The more the forecast depends on it, the more surprising its failure would be, and therefore the more the premortem exercise reveals about the forecast's dependence on it. The 2008 financial models should have been subjected to the premortem question. This model has failed catastrophically. What assumption turned out to be false? The answer, home prices can decline nationally and simultaneously, would have been surprising to the analysts who built the models, which is precisely the evidence that this was the assumption doing the most work. Nokia's competitive analysis should have been subjected to the same question. This analysis has failed to predict the correct competitive outcome. What assumption turned out to be false? The answer, the relevant competitive dimension is hardware quality, not platform ecosystem. Was the assumption embedded in the industry mental model so deeply that it didn't feel like an assumption at all? If the specific technique, asking what would have to be false for this forecast to fail to surface the buried assumption, is what makes this channel worth your time, the like is the direct signal. The human cost of buried assumptions is distributed asymmetrically in the same pattern that appears throughout the cases this channel has examined. The people who built the 2008 financial models, the quantitative analysts, the structured finance teams, the rating agency analysts, experienced the crisis as a professional failure of the models they had built. Many of them have described, in interviews and memoirs, the genuine shock of watching models calibrated on decades of data fail within months of a specific, unprecedented event. The 8.7 million Americans who lost their jobs in the recession produced by the financial crisis had not built the models. They had not made the assumptions. They had not had access to the stress testing scenarios that would have revealed what happened when the assumptions failed. They experienced the consequence of an analytical failure in the most personal possible terms, through the loss of income and security that had no direct relationship to the quality of any analysis they had conducted. The buried assumption in the financial models was an analytical choice made by people with specific technical capability and institutional responsibility. The consequence of that choice was distributed across a much larger population that had no part in making it. This asymmetry between the people whose analytical choices contain the buried assumptions and the people who bear the consequences when the assumptions fail is one of the most consistent patterns in every case this channel has examined. It appears in Enron, in Boeing, in Sears, in Wells Fargo, in every case where an institutional analytical failure produced consequences for a population that was not party to the analysis. The practical lesson from the buried assumption is a single question that should be asked of every significant forecast before the forecast is used to make a decision. The question is, what would have to be false for this forecast to be wrong by a factor that changes the decision? Not what would have to be false for this forecast to be slightly off. Forecasts are always slightly off. The question is specifically about the scenario where the forecast is wrong in a direction and magnitude that changes what you would have done if you had known. What assumption is the forecast most dependent on, and what would happen to the decision if that assumption turned out to be false? The LTCM pre-mortem question would have produced, if the historical correlations fail simultaneously during a global liquidity crisis, what does our model produce? The answer, catastrophic loss that exceeds available capital, would have changed the leverage decision if it had been explicitly evaluated before the leverage was taken on. The Nokia competitive analysis pre-mortem question would have produced, if the relevant competitive dimension turns out to be platform ecosystem rather than hardware quality, what does our market position look like? The answer, vulnerable, because our platform is fragmented and our ecosystem is underdeveloped, was knowable before 2007. The question is available in advance. The answer is often not comfortable. The discomfort is the specific evidence that the assumption being tested is the one doing the most work. that the forecast most depends on it, and that its failure would be most consequential. Most forecasts never get asked this question. The assumption remains buried until the forecast fails. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.